I appreciate the comment that Sundiata Acoli, who is an incredible leader who has been in prison now for more than 40 years because he was a member of the Black Liberation Army. And he was captured, he was with Assata Shakur when she was wounded and on the New Jersey Turnpike, and he fought the cops and escaped for a while. But he always said that the more sweat in peace, the less blood in war. And that's testimony statement to how the stance of the working class must be. Under the leadership of the advanced detachment, we have to sweat like rain. We have to do everything necessary, make every sacrifice to win our liberation, and to do everything to learn how to govern, to how to be responsible for our own affairs, to be self-activating. This is something that the class has to be trained to do, and this is one of the reasons why the advanced detachment, the African working class, under the leadership of its own party, the African People's Socialist Party, plays such a fundamental role. And this is why I'm sitting now in an African community in St. Petersburg, Florida, and there are members of our party who are participating in this study in Everton, West and South Africa, in Houghton. There are members who participate in this study in the African communities as they exist in places like London and Texas, Houston, Texas, in the United States, where the working class itself is engaged in discussions of the sort that only representatives of the bourgeoisie usually participate in, or intellectuals from our community who seldom leave the comforts of the ivory towers that they occupy, except for perhaps to go to forums where they discuss the latest clever thing that they have written or read. The working class itself must be armed. This is what this discussion is about. This is what this study is about. So we're looking at, again, Maurice Cornforth's book on dialectical and historical materialism, or dialectical materialism, looking at the dialectical method. And I want to say that in many ways there's severe limitations to this discussion by Cornforth. Cornforth is a scholar, and he did what he did quite well. He laid out a formula for this discussion that could be helpful. But the problem for us is that the basic premise of Cornforth and most Marxists is so flawed that it makes it necessary often for us to come behind him and to explain that while Cornforth was right in this way and right in that way, his error was this and thus. And so that complicates the discussion. I'm saying that I want everybody to read this. I want everybody to read Cornforth, a book that we are studying from, and to understand it, and this issue of materialism and the dialectical method. But the thing that in the final analysis that's going to be extremely helpful is if you will read, comrades, the political reports to our party, especially the 6th and 7th, the report to the 6th and 7th Congress and the 4th Congress. I mean, these are critical presentations, and they are based on historical materialist analysis that stems from African internationalism. Cornforth was not an African internationalist. He was a Marxist. But the value of Marx was that he helped to develop the whole a method of investigation and analysis that we refer to as dialectical materialism. And that's really helpful. But if you read Uneasy Equilibrium, which is all about what we're talking about now in terms of the new and the old, which is all about what we are talking about now in terms of negation of negation. If you read that, and then if you read this, and if you participate in this discussion, you ought to be able to grasp and understand and work with even better the ideas that associated with dialectical and historical materialism. So the first thing I want to say is that a fundamental error, a fundamental flaw in Marx's assumption is this description of what they refer to as the development of human society. And as it's addressed according to the Marxist formula, human society has moved from this process from the lower to the higher level, a sort of stair step, if you will, instance of development. And with each level of development coming about as a consequence of contradictions, of the articulation and working out of contradictions in the previous step. For example, according to Marx, the starting point in the development of human society would have been what they call primitive communism, where there was no exploitation, no oppression of people by people, no exploitation of women and what have you. But there were, and where up until then, the primary contradictions existed between human beings and nature itself. How to get what we needed to eat, and how do we protect ourselves from the elements, and through clothing and housing and stuff like this. And this was like the fundamental contradiction. And then, of course, according to, and I'm not going into the details of it, but the Marxist concept of human development, we move from this era of primitive communism, where no class contradiction, no class struggle, no oppression and what have you in society, to this era of slavery. And when we talk about slavery here, we're not talking about what has come to be known as slavery in the whole world, that which occurred to our Africa and to African people. When we talk about slavery here, we are talking about slavery of that stems from the Slavs. That's where the word slave comes from. It's Slavs, people who lived in Europe and what have you. This is the imposition of domination in Europe by Europeans of other sectors of the Europeans, especially the Romans and what have you. And then from this, there's the contradictions there leads to the emergence of a new social system as they are articulated, worked out, struggles happen, and new social system comes into existence where from slavery, where the primary contradiction existed between the slaves and the slave owner. Now a new system is born, and the primary contradiction exists between the peasants and feudal and the serfs who worked in what they call feudalism, where now, as unlike the instance where the people were bought and sold in slavery and got nothing for their labor under feudalism, persons are not bought and sold, but they live on the land that's owned by the nobility, owned by the landlords. In fact, that's where the landlord concept comes from, that you experience even today. And that the landlord would appropriate most of the value that was produced by the persons who worked on the land, on the landlord's land. And this was feudalism, and this lasted for nearly 1,000 years in Europe. And Europeans were extraordinarily impoverished and had nothing, no rights, nothing, so to speak of. And the great myths of the nobles and nobilities, the King Arthurs and all of this stuff, and the great myths of the Robin Hood comes from this feudal era. And then from feudalism, this mysterious thing occurs where the contradictions inside feudalism is what's supposed to give rise, if according to the logic of the Marxism, to a new social system. And from feudalism there springs contradictions as they articulated, worked out a new social system that's called capitalism. Now, mind you, according to the Marxists, this is the development of human society, not European society, human society. And of course, what becomes clear with study is what they are characterizing as human society is European society. And so from feudalism, we achieved this place called capitalism, where the primary contradiction no longer is existing between the serfs or the peasants and the landlords. In fact, the landlords themselves have been minimized in terms of their significance, and the peasants and serfs in many instances have been pushed off the land, made landless, and dependent upon being able to sell the value of their labor power to this new force that has emerged that's called the capitalists. The capitalists now dominate everything. And so this is the narrative that the understanding of how things are developed in the world according to the Marxist formula. But the reality is that we can't let them get away with that because there's this hiccup, there's this breakdown in this process of moving from feudalism to capitalism. When they talk about the contradictions that gave rise to capitalism stemming from the contradictions inside the social system itself, and yet what Marx says is that in order to understand the emergence of capitalism, we have to presuppose that there was an accumulation of capital that was not a consequence of capitalist production, but the starting point of the entire thing. And he said the starting point of the entire thing was turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. This is the critical point that everybody needs to understand, that the capitalist system rests upon a base of enslavement of Africa in particular. But beyond that, much of the world as it looks today is a consequence of the emergence of capitalism and the primitive accumulation of capital. When you look at the Americas, and you look at the fundamental difference in the conditions of a lot of peoples in the world and Europe. It comes from this primitive accumulation of Europe robbed, looted, raped, and even achieved this identity and all of its wealth and resources through this process that gave rise to what we now know as capitalism. Capitalism came at the expense of the rest of us. And so it's not like this was the development of human society. And even though Marxists constantly talk about how capitalism represented a kind of progress in human society, it was only progress for a sector of human society. That would be Europeans effectively, essentially. And the rest of us, it was hell. And it was pushing many of us out of history. There are people who don't exist any longer as a consequence of the rise of capitalism. There are people, most of us, who live in horrible states of despair, poverty, deprivation as a consequence of the emergence of capitalism. And most of the contradictions that we see struggling for resolution in the world today stem from the advent of capitalism itself at the expense of Africa, at the expense of other peoples around the world. This explains the wealth and relative well-being of Europeans as compared with everybody else. That's something that Cornforth and the Marxists do not explain, cannot explain. And that's why it was our task to do that. And that's why we are not Marxists. This is not an anti-Marxist statement. It is simply we are dialectical and historical materialists. We use the methods of investigation and analysis that Marx and Engels and people like him worked, and I think seriously to develop. And we've come to different conclusions than Marx has come. We've used the science and we've come to different conclusions. And nor should that be something that upsets people unless you're some kind of religious believer, you know. I mean, like in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was Marx. And if you're like that, if you of course, Marx himself would be the first to engage in serious struggle with that perception of him. He worked really hard at being a materialist, but materialist, like everybody else, our worldview is informed and shaped effectively and essentially by the world in which we live, and our location in that world in which we live. So we want to have this discussion, and we want to have this discussion at a time where we are fighting inside the United States against all forms, and the world, of opportunism, liberalism, which dominates. We are watching Venezuela being starved to death, where the bourgeoisie is doing everything it can. That is an imperialist, white power imperialist, to isolate Venezuela, to having overthrown the government of Bolivia in the last couple of days, and much of the world in a quandary in terms of how to understand what the hell is going on. Because of the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 1960s was so complete that at a time where these discussions that we're having today dominated the world, where the time where there was Mao Zedong and engaged in ideological and theoretical discussion and political work, at a time where Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution did challenge the basic notions, not only of imperialism, but liberalism and opportunism, at a time when the Africans in the housing projects inside the United States making the most fierce struggles against the imperialist state as it made itself concretely manifest in this country, at a time where people in Grenada and people in various other places around the world were actually in a huge contest with imperialism. Now this has been defeated, and we have suffered the consequence of that defeat now for more than 2 generations, almost 50 years. And now we see forces who engage in this struggle. They don't start from the perspective of completing a revolution. They are now discovering contradictions in many ways. They're starting from a place where the imperialists now have regained almost absolute control of the narrative and the worldview of most peoples in the world, and especially of African petty bourgeois, middle-class forces, and intellectuals. So Evo Morales has been overthrown in Bolivia. And somebody has to say, again, as we understood in the past, that this is natural when you have what's supposed to be a revolution that does not represent in the acquisition of state power by the working class. When the workers do not have state power, that is the army, the military, the court system, and what have you, it remains in the hands of class enemies of the working class. The colonial capitalist class, extended all the way to Washington, D.C., continues to do this. We saw that with Pinochet, who overthrew the military chief, who overthrew the Allende government in Chile at a time where people thought that because a socialist had been elected to power in Chile, that socialism had arrived, and revolutionaries from all over the world, certainly throughout South America, in droves to this place of socialists where socialism was prevailing, only to be rounded up and stuffed in soccer camps by the military under the direction and leadership, and certainly with the support of the U.S. regime, and especially Henry Kissinger, and exterminated. We don't know how much our movement was set back then. How much was our movement set back when, because it was assumed that Patrice Lumumba won an election in Congo, that we had power, but the state was still in the hands of the Belgians and the French and the United States. In fact, Kennedy and Eisenhower participated in helping to kill Lumumba from afar, and they were able to do that using the military forces that had been created by the bourgeoisie that was assisted by the United Nations, which was another bourgeois, U.S. bourgeois creation. What about the military that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah? We were so enthusiastic about seeing Nkrumah come to power in Ghana, and he had so many aspirations and hopes for us, and so he won the election, but the military was still controlled by Sandhurst and the British and the Americans and what have you, and so they were able to overthrow Nkrumah. The point being, comrade, from my perspective, is that people inside the United States assume that the revolution is going to be made for us by comrades in Bolivia, or comrades in Venezuela, or comrades in all these other places, that somehow this is what's going to make it happen. Of course, they don't have state power, and we haven't developed a movement in this country and many other places to intervene in the ability of the U.S. imperialist state to do what it wants to do in Bolivia and other places like that. We don't even recognize the struggle, generally speaking. The party does. And this is what this discussion is about, recognizing the struggle for state power. And also this takes us to this whole issue of the new and the old, which is what the political report to the 7th Congress was all about. When we talk about an uneasy equilibrium, we talk about a contest between the past and the future, which is what our upcoming plenary which is going to be happening February 1st through the 3rd here in St. Petersburg, Florida, under the slogan, Vanguard Up, the relationship between practice and the unity of practice and struggle. And so we're going to look now at chapter 9, the new and the old. That's what it's all about. That's what we're looking at. And this whole issue of negation, think about that too. Because negation as a philosophical concept of dialectic is a really important thing. And that's not something that's easily understood or mostly understood in this country, because people